Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Mad Mamluks. My name is Sim. We have a wonderful show for you this evening. We have our brother from where are you staying now, Mobeen?
Laurel, Maryland.
Laurel,
So,
Maryland. The
yeah.
Master Blaster himself, Mobeen Vaid, has joined us today, and for good reasons. We have a lot of salacious, sizzling social media drama, uh,
Yeah.
stuff that I guess. Well, one of my friends was telling me he works for a major Islamic masjid, and he's like, you know what? Most people don't even understand this stuff and can't even navigate these conversations. So hopefully, Mubin is here to help us understand some things a little bit better. But what we're talking about, if you haven't been on social media lately, you're probably better off actually. But if you may behoove you to check out our description and see some of the links that I posted before listening to this episode. It'll help put things into better context so that you understand a lot of the various issues that are happening within Muslim leadership in the United States. Um, and before, and I just, it would be remiss of me if I did not mention how this podcast has allowed me and a lot of the members in my team to meet a lot of the brothers we are going to be talking about, or we might mention, or we may not mention. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't question anyone's intention, integrity, sincerity, and I'll let Mubin speak for himself. But as far as I'm concerned, everyone who I've been able to meet has met me with open arms, and I cannot ever question their sincerity at all. Anyway, Mubin, how you doing, bro?
Good. Alhamdulillah. How about yourself?
Good, alhamdulillah. So let's go ahead and help out our listeners in understanding what we're talking about. And why don't you start things off by explaining a little bit about what happened that led up to this point? Let's scroll back a little bit back towards maybe RIS with Hamza Yusuf when he called out some of the major Islamic movements, or maybe before that. There's been some kind of a rift that's evolving with regards to how Islamic leadership and Islamic movements or Islamic activists are kind of, have taken two separate trajectories, and also, how international politics kind of have taken a hold of both, respectively.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that if I don't know that I have a sort of comprehensive genealogy or history of this. I think the storm that we're witnessing a little bit has been brewing for some time. And I think it's motivated by a handful of things. I think certainly there's been a fair number of activists who are dissatisfied with what they see by American Muslim leaders, particularly those who are viewed as participating in scholarly capacities in various political programs, whether that's domestically or internationally, although the international front has gotten more attention over the last few years, especially with the UAE. Um, in addition to that, I think that some of what we're seeing is just a reflection of what's taking place politically around us. That politics is becoming a lot more polarized than it's been in the past. And as a result of that, there is a greater demand for ideological and political purity, and for people to justify themselves through a sort of confrontation ethic that if someone is wrong, uh, they are aggressing on untold numbers of people, and as a result of that, they should be forced into justifying themselves into the public. And I think for a number of years now, at least the last 2 to 3 years, that people have sort of been clamoring for that from some Muslim scholars who haven't really tried to articulate the rationale behind the decisions that they're making. And to some degree, I think what we're seeing is are pieces and articles that are becoming more biting and more full throated in their critiques of these individuals, largely because they don't feel that their concerns and reservations are being dignified or given the time of day.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna go ahead and uh,
Yeah,
give the two different trajectories that are headed. There's right
sure,
now, who's under the spotlight is Hamza Yusuf and Zaytuna,
sure.
members of Zaytuna, or faculty members of some sorts. Um, and then they, the allegations that they have ties to the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Again, allegedly, I'm
Sure.
not accusing anyone. I don't know of any hard evidence that whether they're receiving funds or not, but there are
I
certain.
think it's been the UAE more than Saudi Arabia, right? I don't
Right.
know that the Saudi Arabia has played as big a role geopolitically in all of this. Although I guess the person may say that it's a conduit because of MBS's relationship with Mohammed bin Ziyad.
Yeah, I'm just,
More of
well,
a
I want,
proxy
yeah, I
relationship.
don't know if
Yeah.
Zaytuna is actually receiving funds, is what I'm saying. Like, I don't know if
Oh,
Zaytuna is
from
the,
Saudi. Oh, yeah,
yeah,
I don't
or
know
from
that.
UAE. I don't,
Oh, from the UAE.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
because there are allegations being made regarding that as well. That
sure,
Zaytuna is not disclosing whether they've actually received funds from these various Gulf countries. So
sure.
there's and then there's also not just that. I don't think it's one single thing, Mubin. I think
Sure.
there's a layered approach, because
Yeah.
the old adage goes, if you're gonna shoot the king, make sure you kill him. Like, they would, like, a lot of these social justice warriors, they're not like, they're not complete idiots. They wouldn't just go after, especially like Ali Al-Arian's article, the other strand, the activist movement. They wouldn't have gone after Zaytuna without, having a bunch of things kind of built in, really trying to build a case towards something, right? Whether it's circumstantial or not, or whether they have hard evidence towards anything, but
Sure. Yeah.
they have some kind of case that they're trying to build, because you see from various faculty members at Zaytuna that there is a different type of message coming out. There's a sort of alignment towards conservative America. They're trying to build bridges with conservative America, and I kind of saw that with regards to specific members of Zaytuna, and I was very enamored by that, and I thought, oh wow, these guys are really thinking out of the box. But I didn't know that there is, well, I didn't know that there may be, and I'm not sure, maybe you can help me clarify, is there any correlation to this change of strategy, that they're going to be targeting conservative America while also working with international players that are traditionally tied to conservative America, ironically, it's Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Did you find that strange at all, or is it just me?
I don't know. I don't know. I think,
Because I mean, it's not just one person.
sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
and just brothers I respect a lot. We had brother bin Hamid Ali and other
Yeah.
Zaytuna members on our show, and these guys, I'm going on the record, I'm telling you, I love these guys. Like,
Sure.
they're
Mashallah.
really
Yeah, yeah.
genuinely good people. Like,
Yeah.
and
Sure.
and always willing to hear you out. And I've seen people be genuine, like disgustingly rude to them online, and
Sure.
they are super polite and really patient with so many people, no matter
Sure.
the tone that they received. So
Yeah.
that's one strand, right? We got the Zaytuna thing out. Now, the activist is a more of a very generalized term. It's there's the Islamists, there's left wing Muslims who want to engage with leftists in American politics. There's who am I missing in the activist crowd? There's even hybrids, people who are also activists who are engaging with the left, the American left, and then there's also an Islamic
Many
sentiment among the,
Muslims who just have a
yeah,
lot of justice-oriented
right.
predispositions. Yeah.
So
And
and
people are
and the activists
anti-Islam.
are aligned mainly with Turkey and Qatar, right? If I could just,
Yeah, geopolitically, it seems to be that they're more favorable and forgiving of things that Qatar and
and there's a
Turkey and
tendency to support, Erdogan or president, the former president, Shahid Morsi, and the Muslim Brotherhood, at least a moderate Muslim Brotherhood. We can't, and I don't want to associate like any fringe elements of the Muslim Brotherhood to the activists over here, because clearly that's not what they represent. But I thought that this might help some of the listeners who are kind of engaging with this content understand things a little bit better. It's a loose alliance that's kind of operating within the activist community, and I thought that was kind of interesting as well.
Well, maybe what it's good to do is take a step back and just even at the broad level, what we have is what's really generated this has been three things, right? You had the Ali Al-Arian article, which was Al Jazeera, and it was very sweeping. It was broad, but it did cover a lot of ground in identifying names, actors, and people who are allegedly doing things that are very troubling or concerning vis-a-vis foreign politics or domestic political decisions that seem to be undermining the Muslim community here and abroad, right? I think that's sort of a broad understanding that, again, that's a bit of a generalization, but I think that captures the thrust of what he was trying to make an argument around. And so the thesis is essentially that American Muslim political participation is impotent. It's impotent because of how morally compromised it is, that it's lacking in integrity. And two of the people that he named in that article were Imam Zaid Shakir and Dr. Sherman Jackson, and both of them responded, defending themselves, defending their institutional affiliations, defending the type of politics that they've been partaking in against the type of criticisms that he levied against them. And so Imam Zaid Shakir did it initially through his Facebook post, and then he published something on his website, New Islamic Directions. Dr. Jackson wrote a lengthier piece on the Alim Program's blog, where he himself wrote a somewhat lengthy defense of himself and what he believes to be a appropriate political program for Muslims to take on, and the types of attitudes that we need to have with one another.
Well, do you find it odd that they responded? Because, I mean, we've recently kind of thrown a Muslim organization under the bus inadvertently on a show, and they just chose not to respond. Why do you think they chose to respond to Ali this time?
Yeah, I think obviously Al Jazeera is a very public platform. I think it's a bit different than just receiving criticisms on Facebook or Twitter, right? Or even receiving criticisms on some lesser known platforms, right? Middle East Eye or TRT News, those types of things. I don't think they have the same traction and visibility overall. I think in addition to that, the language and criticisms were very condemnatory and seemed to strike a chord with them both. I think some of the notions around impotence, the lack of moral integrity being alleged, I think that there was something there that certainly struck a nerve.
I have a different theory.
With a lot of the people that were criticized. What's your theory?
I think Ali made himself open. He left himself open to some critique, or some holes in his story, and I think maybe you can expound on that, because again, like I said before, when you take a shot at the king, you got to make sure you kill him. You can't go after Zaid Shakir, man. You can't. How are you going? That's not a. I mean, especially with the stuff that he had, it was very like. It wasn't strong. I mean, what did he have? A hashtag Blue Lives Matter at the bottom of his post, and that's, you can't really build a something very. You can't expect people to take you seriously when you just are kind of taking that little piece and trying to go after Zaid Shakir,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know that people have the same standards that they would hold him to, that they're going to hold these scholars to. So in the general public side, they may be more forgiving of some of his overreaches.
Yeah.
Right. But it's important to call them out, to your point.
Yeah.
I think one of the difficulties with this article is that there's a conglomeration of seemingly legitimate criticisms, some that are more tenuous because they are arrived at through implication, right? This person's part of an organization who has someone else on the board, who has delivered money to somebody else. And so they're sort of being associated with things that, oftentimes people can fall into this unwittingly, right?
Yeah.
Most of us don't know our affiliations at that level. If you look, for instance, today at almost every Ivy League institution in America, right? So like Princeton, I think Yale, a number of them, right? They are heavy funders when it comes to their endowments and individual securities and investments that these institutions hold. They're invested deeply in organizations in China and institutions that are orchestrating the oppression of the Uyghurs, right?
Yeah.
And these are technology companies, but they're using advanced machine learning, artificial intelligence, natural language processing, biometric security, and they're doing that to facilitate the dispossession of the Uyghur people. And so, I mean, does every single student on that campus know that? Do activists? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that can catch people by surprise. And so there was also a bit of an absence of charity, right?
Yeah.
The idea that a person may just have an institutional affiliation that they're part of that they don't fully understand or know. And I think we should have some degree of charity before going guns blazing on people and throwing accusations of them that they are in fact moral criminals,
Yeah.
and that they went in eyes wide open, not simply because they had an opportunity to advance a project that they saw as worthwhile, but because they support that nefarious affiliation that's being established through two jumps or more, right?
Yeah.
And in addition to that, you had in certain instances, there were allegations that simply proved to be false or outdated.
Yeah.
And so that was specifically the case with Templeton and what was said about the Templeton Foundation, and that they're funding, I think, Quilliam. And apparently that was dated information from some years ago.
Yeah.
And that internally there's been a remediation of some of those missteps, and they seem to be on track, genuinely trying to facilitate and support financially positive theological projects in the West.
Yeah.
And that may be part of their project of just trying to restore a notion of faith in the West. And they see Muslims as part of that project. And I don't see any reason why we should foreclose on that just because they're Christian, let's say, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the problems that we have, is that on the activist side, politically speaking, and even outside of the activists, we have a broader discursive and a political environment that views religious actors with a tremendous amount of suspicion. And so when a person throws out a number of allegations, I think the community response and the way that the public interprets those is to actually trust the nature of those allegations. And so there is a sort of guilty until proven innocent method and approach that functionally plays out. And it's very difficult for a person who's been accused of a number of things to mount a defense for him or herself, given the conditions of how these debates take place in the public eye. And, I think we have to have a way in which people can deliberate these things and provide for public accountability to Muslims who are concerned, without arriving at hasty judgments and not allowing for individuals to at least articulate what their own defense is, and to provide them a means by which they can clarify things. And so there is at times a rush to judgment. And because of that rush to judgment, what I see is a radicalizing of discussions, because it becomes tribal. A person feels, personally offended. And that personal offense can lead to a type of anger that's visceral at times. And, when people are now defending their own personal honor, things can very quickly deteriorate when it comes to the way in which we need to have a discourse. And we have to be honest. On social media, these types of discussions are not simply about the substance of the issues, but they are in large part about people's engrossment with just daily gossip.
Yeah.
And social media feeds that need that people have in their sort of lowly nafsani self to acquire gossip and obtain the latest on what's taken place.
Yeah,
and social media, WhatsApp, Twitter, they just feed that continuously. And so it can become so toxic. And it's unfortunate, because for a person to be able to just wade through all of this and try to figure out, look, there is actually an objective concern that needs to be arrived at and discussed. how can we do that given the conditions of the conversation? And it's going to be substandard, but the idea is we have to find a way to play it out. And my own argument that I made is that I think Muslims who are traditionally concerned, including scholars, have to be able to participate in this with a lot more generosity than they are today, given the fact that they are in a position of disadvantage. They simply are. And they have a greater responsibility to try to transcend those circumstances and speak to people to some degree with where they're at. Allah knows best.
The problem here, Mobeen, is that they've really they messed up in their response. I mean, they could have really, taken advantage of the situation and said, hey, in the beginning we didn't know exactly what CVE or whatever engagements that they were participating in. We didn't know what it was. Whatever, they could have used this as an opportunity. Like, hey, because let me give you some context. A year or so ago, I went on the CVE spree of, I went on it was on my personal Facebook page, and everything was on Google, and I'm like, hey, look what I found, this treasure trove of Muslim organizations that are taking money from CVE programs. And I was just like blasting every organization here and there, and come to find out many of these organizations contacted me and said, like, hey, listen, we didn't know about CVE when it first came out. This guy, he came over to our masjid, and he was trying to tell us about this new program that the government is giving money out to Muslim organizations so that they can combat extremism. And they were initially, who doesn't want to fight extremism? They don't know.
Sure.
These are a lot of the immigrant type uncles who don't really know their way around activist politics and colonial history. I'm sure there are exceptions, but I'm talking about the few, at least 3 or 4 masjids that I've been growing up around in my life. Most of these uncles don't know anything regarding this stuff, and I got slammed by that, and I took responsibility in that respect. I didn't mean to really call out anyone in that regard. I thought, in my mind, that this was a public corruption issue, and I found out that it was more in line with a lot of these organizations or people within their organizations were genuinely ignorant of it, and many times their name got affiliated with CVE just on an inquiry level, and they didn't even receive funds from any government program. So I think if they're responsive, Zaytuna's response was like, hey, this wasn't something that we were envisioning it to be. Here's how much money we made from CVE. We're making a donation back to whatever organization they decide to donate to. I think that would have been a great way to just resolve everything and say, hey, you know what? Because it's pretty much unanimous regarding CVE. Everyone's against it, whether you're you can be from any kind of background regarding Islam, but everyone pretty much understands that CVE, at least if you are following some of the politics surrounding the Muslim community, you understand the horrible nature of why CVE is problematic, that it is specifically targeting Muslims, and it does not address any other type of extremism but Muslim extremism. So what are your thoughts on that?
I'll say a couple of things on that. So I'll say one thing to your first point. I think what we have with what sort of the social justice arena has produced, especially in the last couple of years, is a narrative of transgression and oppressors. But we don't have any concepts or language that can allow us to negotiate that. And I think the reason for that is that we have lost the language of religion and faith, such that people who have made mistakes cannot be redeemed in many people's eyes. So the idea is not so much that we want these people to repent for their mistakes, but that we want them to be disqualified from offering opinion or participating, period, going forward. and this is today oftentimes being referred to as the cancel culture.
Yeah.
The idea isn't so much that I want this person to think critically or reevaluate their prior positions, but that I don't want this person to speak, period. And I'm going to implicate institutions that so much as have a relationship with them, or individuals that have a relationship with them, as being as guilty as they are. And, what the most, the only option many people are left with when these allegations take place, to your point, is even if they have made a honest mistake, is a sort of public humiliation, right?
Yeah.
Is that I don't just have to come out and say that I made a mistake, but I effectively have to come out and do a lot more than that. There's almost no point at which I can move beyond being seen as a person with questionable judgment and as a person who is sort of enmeshed in all sorts of toxic notions of me being privileged and patriarchal and offering a certain types of power narrative, and because I've succumbed to it once.
Yeah.
So the idea is my judgment is always going to be jeopardized as a result of that, instead of saying, look, the best of people can make mistakes, right? And what we want from people is to acknowledge those mistakes and to be able to, in good faith, express the fact that they see those mistakes as mistakes, or at a minimum, recognize the plausibility of the criticisms that are being alleged against them, instead of treating people or criticizing them with condescension and patronizing people as simply being uninformed, irreverential, progressive, reformist, whatever, and seeing them as people who are honestly concerned about the business of justice, which Islam has a lot to say about, right? I mean, we're not talking about something that is entirely foreign to the religion of Allah.
Yeah.
And so we have to be serious about that if we're going to play the card of Islam and tradition. And if that's the basis from which we're coming from, it's our responsibility to try to restore an environment in which our understanding of these subjects, terms, and categories is anchored in the Quran and Sunnah, even if other people aren't doing it, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's that, right? The other part of it on the CVE front, I actually disagree. I think there is a broad-based consensus opposing CVE on social media. And what social media does is it magnifies a certain minority sensibility amongst social justice advocates and people who are very vocally affirmed for the types of positions they come out with on the justice front. But I think if you were to cut across Muslim institutions, I actually think if Hillary Clinton was the president today, I think plenty of them would be working with CVE.
Oh, absolutely. Without a doubt.
I don't think they are conceptually opposed to CVE. I think they're opposed to working with the Trump administration on CVE, precisely because he's not seriously interested in CVE either, right? He's sort of countering radical Islam, and he's far more brazen about the fact that he wants to target in a very discriminatory fashion the Muslim community. The problem is that we can't take for granted that uncles, aunties, and even intelligent and thoughtful Muslims have bought into our narratives as to why CVE is wrong. And so, people will make criticisms of CVE and they say, well, it's disproportionately focused on Muslims and it's a Muslim-only program and it's deputizing masjids. And the response you'll get to that is, well, that is not a problem with CVE. That's a problem with how CVE is materializing and operating. And so what we need to do is improve CVE to rid it of those problematic elements such that it is more broad-based and includes white supremacist groups. And it does not try to deputize Muslims, but becomes more honest in trying to intervene preemptively before young Muslims fall prey to extremist groups, right? So that's the idea, is that we can restore and re-articulate CVE in positive terms, right? Now that itself to me is the type of issue that Muslims should be talking about, because the concept there is that we want to vest in a structure of authority the ability to create characteristic and behavioral profiles of Muslims and to use those profiles to determine whether or not someone is vulnerable to acting in ways that are criminal. And the idea is that before they've acted on anything that's criminal, their mere articulation of politically incorrect positions, even theologically heterodoxical positions, where I'm making takfir of people and doing things like that, is not clearly an indicator that that person's going to go and do anything. Anybody can make takfir on social media, right? That doesn't mean that person's like a Khariji and that he's going to be in like Waziristan tomorrow trying to join the Taliban, right? In fact, a very small number of people who are socially awkward on social media actually go ahead and do those things, right? And even if that was a strong indicator, the question is, do we want to vest in the government the authority to preemptively this is a larger ethical and moral question, which is there's an issue of data and personal privacy, right? Where we are now enabling the government to mine every activity that an individual is doing to be able to anticipate criminal behavior, to stop it before it takes place, right? And in technology, I'm sure you follow sort of machine learning, AI, everything that's taking place, right?
Yeah.
If you look at a company like Google, right? Google uses ML extensively throughout its platform. It uses ML for things like spam filtering, right? And it's incredibly accurate. I think it's like 99 point something % accurate in identifying spam that a person gets in their inbox, right? But the thing is that Google has an immense amount of data, right? I mean, hundreds of millions of people are using Gmail, and they're all getting mail. And so Google is constantly improving its ML algorithms and the method by which it's determining what is and is not spam because of the massive quantities of data that it's receiving. The problem with radicalization is that your sample population is very small. It is exceedingly small. So you're unable to build a large enough data set against which you can do that, even if you're taking in the entire US population of data or all of humanity's data, right? If you just around the world are collecting data from these companies, which is basically what some government agencies are doing today, even then, at best, you're doing something that is an approximation. In addition to that, when you do this, you risk cultivating a culture in which Muslims feel anxious and unsafe in their communities, unsafe in their society. And so as a result of that, they become more prone to radicalization. So it becomes a sort of irony and a paradox where in trying to mitigate and minimize radicalization, you actually enable it and you foment radicalization at levels that didn't exist before. You know, there's an interesting book by a professor from Duke. I can't remember his name for the life, but it's called The Missing Martyrs. It was written a couple of years ago. Yeah. And it actually takes a very sort of, it takes a counterintuitive look at radicalization and terrorism. And it sort of presents the case that given how much violence is being inflicted against Muslim majority countries by Western nations, how come there aren't more people who are getting radicalized? Why are the numbers as small as they are? Because we would actually expect more uprising in these societies. Yeah. We would expect more people to come out and actually violently defend themselves and take up arms, but we're not seeing the sort of numbers that we would come to expect in certain cases. So it's actually, you know, there's also a way in which we can look at these problems as being much larger than they are. And especially in the United States, it's a much smaller problem than what we're getting in some European countries, right? And so to me, I think that as Muslims and others, we should be naturally suspicious of granting the government the type of authority that it's seeking and that it may already have, right? Through the invasive nature of the surveillance apparatus that exists and the amount of data that they're collecting on us, right? Just that what's been enabled through technology and through modern technology. And that's quite scary, right? And in fact, just on a sort of side note, this is actually one of the reasons I thought the Yaqeen Institute made a very, very poor and damaging decision when they criticized Google publicly. And they said Google is causing Islamophobia, right? And they said Google's the cause of Islamophobia because when people are doing searches about stuff on Islam, the top of what's being rendered as an output of those searches is critical information and Islamophobic material instead of Islamically accurate content. And the idea was that Google has a moral responsibility to adjust their search algorithms and manipulate them to promote results that show Muslims in a positive light. Now, Google is not interested, at least not largely interested in, they're not ideologically interested in a way that would lead themselves to Muslim normative commitments across the board. What they're interested in doing is avoiding scandal and avoiding controversy and minimizing criticism, right? And they are perhaps above all else interested in maximizing their own revenue potential, right, across the board.
Of course.
If we're analyzing Google and the way in which they respond to searches, and we say, look, there's something inherently biased in those searches that is leading to the favoring of discriminatory and hostile content and violent content, then we have to be able to build that case on a somewhat objective basis, something that is not so self-interested and ideologically driven. Because when we do that, what we say is that Google, in fact, is authorized to manipulate search results however they want to further a broader sociological and cultural agenda that they see themselves as having moral responsibilities to do. And this is something that many conservative groups have come out against. They're saying that Facebook, Twitter, all these groups are disfavoring conservative content. YouTube, right? All these groups, what they're doing is that they are, in effect, ideologically gatekeeping conservative views from seeing the light of day through what they're favoring and promoting and pushing on people's timelines and what the search results are showing. And these technology companies have perhaps unprecedented access to manipulate public opinion in ways that has never been seen before, right? And I think that is something that we should all be concerned about, is this notion of internet neutrality, net neutrality, how these search engine operators and social media platforms are operating, what type of content they're surfacing to us, and what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
And I think I haven't seen a robust discussion of that, but I actually think that there's a relationship between that and CVE insofar as what we're doing is we're appealing to authority and saying, we want you to mine personal data and from that data enforce rules.
Yeah.
And we want you to enforce the rules of what's right and wrong. And what I'm saying is I think that's a very scary proposition because who you want to do that is the government and social media platforms. And they're doing that in relation to information that is not criminal in content. It's one thing to say, hey, we're not going to allow explicitly criminal activity or criminal behavior.
Yeah.
But we're going to do that against things that we just think is, not in the best interest of society.
But
right?
here's the thing, Mobeen. I remember when Yaqeen did that, I thought about it and I was like, well, yes, this is a manipulation of search results and
Sure.
But the problem is that when people are Googling what is Islam and you have answeringislam.com, which is a Christian apologetics website that, that's created to refute Islam, when that's showing up as your top results, you just kind of like, well, as long as our team wins, who cares about the rules, a lot of people kind of think along that line, right?
Of course, but those people have to be challenged in that thought because the idea is, why is that the first search result, right? Why is it the case that that's coming up? And that's what we have to understand, right? Is Google doing something to favor anti-Muslim content, or is the natural mechanics of a search engine that is designed to provide people what they're trying to get to, surfacing for them in a convenient way content that they're already driving towards, right? I mean, if you look, one of the things that Google has done very well is that they have optimized or minimized the number of pages someone has to cut across. 9 times out of 10, when someone searches on Google, they will find within the first 3 results.
Yeah.
Right? where, I mean, people will use Google instead of typing things into the search bar because of its accuracy. Instead of going to ESPN.com, I'll search ESPN and I'll hit that link, right? I mean, that's how people leverage Google today. And
But
so
here's
I
the thing,
think
Mobeen. A
that,
lot of people can tell you that, if you use that logic, that mode of thinking, then
sure,
you can remove things like affirmative action, all these different things that are in place to help minorities beat the beat the system a little bit, so that they can kind of catch up to what their narrative should be, what they feel like should be representing them, rather than when you're in a country
but
that is in a Christian
sure,
country, and people
sure,
are only finding out about Christian apologetic websites.
yeah,
You're not going to get a fair representation of Islam
sure.
regarding that, right?
But that presupposes that their adjustments to the search engine are going to be exclusive to a sort of affirmative action for Muslims,
Right.
right? If they actually did that, I would be cool with it. I mean, personally,
Yeah.
because I'm self-interested in seeing people see positive results in Islam. I don't want people to catch negative detail or material on Islam.
Yeah.
But that's not what's going on. It's
Okay.
far more sweeping. And where it falls on sort of the social political spectrum is very much in the leftist camp in terms of what they're willing to do,
And that's,
right?
yeah.
And that's a very different attitude than what someone might look at as affirmative action, which is targeted around historically marginalized groups. And people can debate whether or not affirmative action is useful, right, or productive, or whether it's uplifting people the way that it's intended to do so. But regardless, there is a huge distinction between what affirmative action does and what we're expecting Facebook, Google, and Twitter to be doing, or YouTube, right? I think there's a very big difference there.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
okay, now we understand that, we have to get to the bottom of CVE a little bit better, and figure out how we can change some of the rules regarding CVE. But regarding the current exchange, where do you see Zaytuna moving towards? Do you think, in if you're going to do a post game analysis? I know you were telling me the other day you just did a fantasy football draft, and
Yeah.
so let's just do a post game analysis on how both teams go back to the huddle and regroup and figure out how they're going to move the next chess piece. Let's just put it there. I was thinking, if I was Zaytuna, I would kind of shore up my base, get involved in a lot more community work, and perhaps do more engagements and build community trust, so that they can, if there is any problems regarding public relations, they would probably overcome that. On the activist front, I was kind of thinking that they might go back to building a better argument, if I think so.
Yeah.
I think the where they overreached was going after Zaid Shakir with
Hashtag Blue Lives Matter.
yeah, that was just that was not enough.
Yeah.
There, you gotta
or
have.
that he's not condemning Sheikh Hamza Yusuf the way he should. Or
Yeah, my
something
man,
like that.
what's his name, Ahmed Sheikh, he just came out with a incredible article on Muslim matters, where he addressed a poignant article directly at Dr. Sherman Jackson.
Dr. Sherman.
And you gotta say that if you were going to compare both papers, I would say Ahmed's was much more effective in what he was trying to accomplish.
Oh, no question about it. I don't know what they're going to do is the short answer. I think that these are difficult issues, and I think oftentimes, it's not easy to know what to do. In fact, even I'm not sure what the right answer is. I think there are things that I would attempt to do,
Yeah.
and I'd be willing to live with the consequences of those, even if I didn't get the type of response that I'd come to expect. I mean, I certainly would try to engage people in good faith, especially young Muslims. And this is something that's been going on for a while. And I think if people are willing to be more sort of in conversation with the community on a regular basis, and it's not necessarily telling people of every detail and I met with this person and this happened, but just offering a larger framework or paradigm as to what they're trying to get out of politics and why they see it as beneficial for Muslims, right? And why they're trying to act in a way that is reflective of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to act, right? That we're trying to be moral witnesses to our society, right? And we're trying to stand moral witness in our society. If they're able to express and elucidate that to the community, even if it's imperfect, I think you begin to start a dialogue, right?
Yeah.
And I think if you're able to do so in less intense settings, I think that can be helpful for people whose only sort of location of a lot of these discussions is when, everything hits the fan,
Yeah.
right? That's when these discussions take place. And when the discussions are taking place at that moment, it does become very sort of violent online. And you do see a sort of clash and combative environment where it's team and tribal and sort of the rivalries form. There's a lot of accusatory language, and that can actually become an obstacle between people and their ability to concede anything, right? And so you'll see, even in the aftermath of the criticisms of the Arian article, people who are predisposed to his way of thinking and his general intuitions around justice are not willing to give an inch, right? And in fact, they're willing to look at something like a hashtag and say that is actually enough. That is enough, right? And what happened with Imam Zaid Shakir and that hashtag is sort of a unforgivable moment, because what he did was he did support sort of the violent abuse of innocent black men, which is, again, very sort of atrocious connection in my mind, but it's still enough in those people's minds to do that because they're not willing to give any ground, right?
Yeah.
And on the other side, there's no acknowledgement that these criticisms actually have any material to them, that there isn't in them anything that's justified or worth looking at. And that can be, that can be rather troubling to a lot of people who look at this and say, you don't see anything wrong with the activities of the UAE when they are destabilizing the region, when they are killing just untold numbers of Yemeni people with basic impunity and callous indifference, that they are actively working against Islam. And these are countries that are promoting a materialistic secularization of their own societies and disempowering scholars and arresting them left and right. And you're saying that there's no, I mean, look at how these countries treat migrant workers. Wallahi, it is such a shame to me. We go to Umrah, and you see these poor Muslim workers who have no rights in that society, who don't get paid on time, who get treated like trash, right? Filipino maids, and these are people who are literally worthless in these societies to the people that live there. And these are societies that openly bear the flag of Islam and the kalima. And that hypocrisy strikes at something deep within Muslims. And I think that's justified for Muslims to feel that way. I think it is. And we have to be willing to speak to that in a way that's honest and reflective and says, look, if we're doing something that is affiliated with one of these countries, here's what we're doing and here's why we think it is productive. And by the way, we're not naive to these problems, right? We're not ignoring them. In fact, we're trying to use these opportunities to shed light on some of these problems, even if they're not going to go into details around it. I think there has to be that type of transparency, because in its absence, you're asking us to take your word for it. And I think that is a lot to ask of people when sort of it doesn't seem to be that case, when sort of the the publicity that comes out of these events, when the news stories that comes out of these events, when the rhetoric and speeches that are put on display and uploaded only indicate more and more a sort of promotion of a certain type of authoritarianism and justification for the political activities of these countries, and a papering over of the types of really, really disgusting wrongs that they're aggressing across the world. And it's true. Look, we have a lot of faulty countries in the world, but I think it's fair to say that, especially regionally, across the Muslim world, that the UAE is a bit of a unique actor in this regard, right? And the way, the role that they're playing. And it's like Hafid al-Assad, right? And what's going on with the Assad regime in Syria. I mean, there's certain sort of political arrangements in some countries that are not like the others, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't look at Imran Khan the way I look at Sisi,
Yeah.
right? That's not to say Imran Khan's perfect, right?
Yeah.
Naya Pakistan, maybe it's not going to happen, right? But the idea is that if he is faulty, he is somebody who seems to be trying to make amends and build his society, and he's going to make mistakes along the way. And, people who are working with political programs that may be affiliated with him, we might be willing to forgive more, right? Erdogan may have problems, but, at the end of the day, there are things that are, in my mind, very redeemable about the decisions that Erdogan's made, especially things like the absorption of millions,
Yeah.
right, of Syrian refugees and the resettlement of them in Turkey when they basically had nowhere else to go,
Yeah.
right?
And with same with Qatar too, that Qatar absorbed so many people who were, fleeing persecution,
right?
Exiled, the Muslim Brotherhood members and whatnot. That,
Sure.
It's undeniable. And I really was, Zaid Shakir didn't even have to respond to Ali Al-Arian's article, but when he said something about Qatar, hosting bases for Americans, and that Ali Al-Arian didn't mention that just like, oh my God, like you're not really understanding like how Middle Eastern politics function. This is not a black and white issue. Qatar is not being ostracized. It's for theatrics. It's something real. That they're literally thinking about making it an island that they so that they can control its borders. So it was kind of disappointing in that respect,
Well, and I think we should try to provide charity to every. I think Ali. I don't know Ali Al-Arian, but I do feel that he wrote with conviction and sincerity, and he tried very hard to express some of his honest frustrations that he feels with Muslims leaders who are politically engaged.
Yeah.
And I think Imam Zaid and Dr. Jackson responded in like that. They tried very honestly to show, perhaps problematically, right, and not in the best ways, but I think that some of it was trying to demonstrate how, look, this logic can be just as easily deployed in the reverse. But to your point, I think at times it fell short of doing that.
Yeah.
And I think it conveyed to a lot of people reading it as a sort of equivocation of circumstances that are not equivalent at all.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like when I first read Arian's article, I'm like, man, they're gonna grab him on this point, and it's just gonna be, they won't let go, because, I mean, if it would be one thing, building a case against Hamza Yusuf, because he's made, many different statements that are in line with what U.S. conservatives want. I'm just gonna say it very openly, and I think it's fairly obvious that when you're talking along various of the talking points that the conservatives talk with, and then also engaging with the international political actors that also engage with conservative politics, that it doesn't look good. I'm not saying you're an agent of conservative America or anything like that. I'm saying it just doesn't look good, at least with the community, at least even the optics, and even with the and let's be honest, the Muslim community in America is more leftist than anything. I mean, at least the ones that are prominent and the ones that have all the institutional power. You're not seeing any Republicans come to your mosque to get votes. It's all Democrats, right? So
well, I feel like one of the problems that we have is that we don't really have a sort of robust analysis of what's taking place in America amongst American Muslims. And what you see from us more often than not is reactionism, right? We're sort of a reactionary community. And so we're very much focused on the sort of latest political anecdote and fighting in those culture wars, as opposed to trying to situate those issues in a larger framework of understanding what's happening in the West. That's a bigger issue altogether. I think as part of that, we don't have a discourse that is indigenous to our faith, that would allow us to navigate these issues in a way that is honest and faithful to the Quran and Sunnah. And so the best we can do is effectively appropriate or borrow language from people who we might think are closer to who we are and may have important and useful insights in certain situations, but ultimately commit us to any number of things that we wouldn't substantively agree with in any other way. And so you're right. And I think that what we're seeing out of the social justice movement is obviously very concerning as part of that as well. I think in some ways the social justice abandonment of faith and real religion, like solid religion, in any way that's not sort of superficial, like sort of the unapologetic stuff, right? In any way that's real, embodied, lived, focused on God, right? That's not sort of present in their political program. And because it is so stripped and deprived of any spiritual reference, I think that many scholars are understandably concerned because they look at it and they say, we see a political program that really doesn't feel like it has to justify itself against the Quran and Sunnah, and quite often contradicts it in very important and explicit ways, right? And so what do we make of all of that? Right. The idea is that we have to try to counteract that. And the way to counteract that, at least in a way that's acknowledged politically today, is to attach oneself to the conservative social and political trends. And some of those are effective, some of them are not effective. And obviously, conservative actors are a mixed bag. There are some thoughtful conservatives. Unfortunately, they're a minority. And what we see as part of public conservatism is sort of the Trump stuff, right? Which is not only superficial and trivial, but is really bigoted and sort of nativist. It is there's a very almost a shrill and bitter dialectic. It's constantly focused on distractions and hostile accusations of the other. I mean, it is not the type of discourse that is mature or that anybody of faith should want to get behind, right? And I think that's obviously the what can trouble a lot of Muslims, right?
Yeah. Well, so what was I getting at? I lost my train of thought before I even said it.
Oh, sorry, I know I go on long. Yeah.
What did you make with in regards to a lot of the philosophers that got associated with the modern day social justice movement? Do you think that there is an underpinning of post-enlightenment philosophy that's really taken hold in the social justice movement, or is this genuinely a sense of people wanting to do good? Because I remember in Zaid Shakir's notes, he mentioned 4 or 5 different philosophers at least from the Enlightenment period that he was trying to attribute Ali Al-Arian's camp with I think Michel Foucault and Marx and them.
Marx, he had a number of others.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I don't know. I think there's something to be said about the fact that we need to interrogate and understand the roots of the culture that we live in today. And the types of attitudes and sensibilities that we have are somehow connected to those things. But because our lives sort of exist at more of the cosmetic level, we don't really see the connection between those thinkers and the types of attitudes that we've absorbed. Most people don't know the sort of underpinnings of the types of commitments that they have or where they emerge from. Many people fancy themselves as very creative and critical thinkers.
Yeah.
But all they've done is basically done a sort of unconscious taqleed, right, to whatever held cultural authority and weight in their sort of sociological moment and their political moment. And I think that's something that's
it's also the logical conclusions. Like if you agree with a certain set of logical conclusion, especially when it comes to things like critical race theory, right? Things that we've talked about on our podcast. Um, there's when when you agree with many different conclusions, you start understanding some of the underpinnings of these philosophies, right? And then you're like, oh, okay, well, this coincides with other conclusions I've made regarding X, Y, and Z. So hence, those underpinnings might also. I'm not saying in all cases, but there it could be. That might be why what Zaid Shakir was alluding to when he was, talking about that. No, but
Well, I think what you're seeing happen in the U.S., right? If you sort of look at the trajectory of the West and the United States in particular, from World War II to basically today, you've had this consistent motif of a progressing society. That if we sort of viewed the United States from that period till now, and we judged it against quality of life metrics and things like that, we find consistent improvement overall, right? We are, the GDP is rising, becoming more economically viable. We're minimizing unemployment. We can debate whether or not culturally the society is improving and their morals are improving, because you have things like the sexual revolution and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, there's sort of a broader vindication of the fact that we are reaching new heights that we haven't previously. And as a result of that, we're sort of the pioneers of the entire world. Yeah. What you're seeing over the last couple of years is a destabilization of that prior conviction, largely because Americans are coming to the realization that society isn't in a continual mode of progress, and that we may actually be much closer to periods of decline and regression than many of us know. And so we're seeing a decline in quality of life across America. And with that, you're seeing a number of social realities that are coming to the fore that are exacerbated and intensified from how they were previously. So you're seeing fewer people get married, fewer people enter into family life. You're seeing few people who have faith. Right? Very few people have faith today. And you have the proliferation of effectively individuals who commit to nothing, right? They identify themselves as the nuns. They have no religious affiliation whatsoever. And what that does is it leads to a type of destabilization, right? There are a lot of theories as to why this crisis exists in the West. There's I don't know if you're familiar with sort of Thomas Piketty. He writes about economic changes and how they've broken the sort of social contract between labor and capital. You'll have Chris Caldwell, Douglas Murray, where they write about unrestricted immigration as driving sort of populism and things like that. I write on my own blog, and I don't know that I get it right all the time, but the sort of thesis that I try to propose is that our problems today are rooted in a sort of spiritual malaise, and that we have secularized ourselves to a point that we've left people with a world of critical thinking skepticism, but we haven't filled that void or vacuum with a positive and affirmative way of understanding the world, society, their purpose in it, and any transcendent realities to which they should have commitments. And so there becomes no future in this world beyond the self, right? It's just all about me. Exactly. And I think what you see with social justice specifically today is an attempt to fill that void, where people can live for more than themselves. And you have a discourse surrounding social justice that draws on very transcendental motifs of doing what's right and being on the side of justice and service and living for more than oneself, and the types of responsibilities that people have. They're constantly invoking the language of morality. And I think what you see with ethno-nationalism is equally trying to fill that void, because what conservatives, many of them, are looking at their society and saying, well, what can give us meaning? What can give us meaning is our state and the affiliations that we have to the country that we live in. Being an American gives us meaning. Having pride in our ancestors gives us meaning. And mass immigration and the demonization of Western history as if it is completely irredeemable compromises that. And so there becomes very sort of violent fights and disputes around all of those things. But there's searches and their ongoing searches for people to try to find purpose and meaning in their life.
Yeah.
And Muslims have basically found themselves in the midst of all of this dysfunction. And what they're doing is they're attaching themselves and tethering themselves to what I think is simply a fashionable current of the moment. But they do so in ways, and you know, especially on the left, part of this is this idea that my principle, sort of the cardinal identity that I observe myself off of, is that I am part of a marginalized group that has been a victim, and that I am a victim. And Islamophobia is central to that internalization of victimology and victimhood. And I actually think that what that can do is it can turn Islam into just another political football of the moment.
Yeah.
So it trivializes belief. It trivializes the relationship that one is supposed to have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it predicates one's religion and one's religious identity on the basis of political debates that themselves aren't often seriously justified and are in fact quite diluted on the basis of belief, because we don't have, if you look at many of sort of the Muslim civil rights circuit, it is not based on a strong notion of normative commitments. And the reason behind that is that the common argument is, well, you know, if someone's going to do Islamophobia, they don't care whether you're from Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah or if you're Shia, or they don't care if you're Qadiani. They don't even care if you're Muslim, right? They don't care if you're Sikh, right? And so we just need to have this sort of big tent understanding of Islam for political purposes. And Islamophobia is sort of the attendant discourse that draws on that. But the implications of that is that it sort of reinforces in people's minds the notion that our Islam is actually quite plastic, that it is broad-tented, that it's all about diversity and pluralism, and you know that it doesn't have a structured meaning behind it, nor is it revolving around the idea of submission, which is what Islam is. And so we have to figure out very seriously, I think right now, how to be political actors that can be sensitive to Muslims who are facing discrimination and difficulties, who may not be as committed, understandably so, without internalizing that as a true and authentic definition of what Islam is supposed to mean for people. Because when Islam does not mean submission to God, it will invariably become cheapened. And I think we're seeing a very serious cheapening of Islam, wittingly or unwittingly, on the basis of political programs. And these are things that are being done by social justice actors and traditionalists, both. I see this as being something that many people are falling into, sometimes genuinely and honestly. But because they want to counteract what they see as problematic politics, they make the locus of their individual definition some short-term political gain, and this notion of me being a victim, which itself has all sorts of problems on its own.
Yeah. Well, Mobeen, you know, a lot of times guys like us, we're the ones who lose out the most, because we try to look at both sides, and you know, we end up saying, you know what, Ali's got a point here, and Zaid Shakir's got a point here, and so on, you know, and then no one ends up saying, oh, look, this guy, he's not on my team, and that person starts unfriending you and, you know, unfollowing you, and we always end up, you know, at the short end of the stick, because we try to assess the situation and try to, you know, help people understand things without their own biases, you know, and look at the objective.
So charged.
Yeah, you know, you want to look at the objective reality and how it relates to your core foundations. You know, what you mentioned about the social justice warrior in its current form being a byproduct of capitalism is something just amazing, because we've been talking about this concept on our podcast, trying to understand where this concept of me comes from, you know, this inherent core of selfishness in capitalist societies. And it's just so profound that you brought that up, that even the social justice a purpose of meaning, or the, you know, fulfilling the human desire to have meaning in your life is coming from a inherent selfishness. That's part of.
Well, it's an inherent loss of theological location and spiritual location. It's a lack of that sort of more full notion of religion that has resulted in sort of these very cheap and reduced and diluted notions of Islam and being unapologetic and being a Muslim, which itself can almost result in a sort of caricatured Islam, which is so obvious to people that it's like, well, if that's apologetic, then we don't really know what apologetic means anymore, right?
Yeah.
If that's what it means, because it's such a broad divergence from what Islamic normative commitments are. And, this is tough. I think one of the reasons that we have these problems, and I wrote about this a little bit, is just it's the nature of social media itself. And social media, I think we have to be honest about the fact that, when we talk about social media and we talk about technology, we think that this phone, for instance, or whatever, it's supplementary to our existence.
Yeah.
But, it is our reality for plenty of people. It is more than simply an addiction. It is the principal life that they're living. And when people's primary mode of engaging with other human beings is on social media, they lose the ability to negotiate interpersonal conflict, right? When I'm living with people primarily, I have to understand how to mete out differences in a way that's proportional to the wrongs, right? And I have to understand things that are forgivable, that not every wrong is something that requires me to go off on somebody, right? I don't have to go code red on someone because they made a minor mistake, right? But social media sort of inures us from that. And it tells us that small mistakes are sort of microaggressions that have to be treated with an immense amount of hostility and have to be found out, because if we let those go, then tomorrow what we're going to have is the KKK, right? Or some other crazy radicalized group, instead of recognizing that there are times where human beings are going to make minor mistakes, and we have to be able to, even if we're going to give them nasiha and try to help them with those mistakes, we have to be able to do so in a way that's healthy. But again, how do you do that for people who don't have a really serious and rich real life, right? A lot of people on social media are single, no kids, unmarried, and there's a lot of personal failings there that are not transparent to people, right? A person cannot see sort of instabilities on Facebook when someone's sort of emotionally or psychologically unstable and they're lashing out at people on social media. That's not something that necessarily is obvious, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen people debate on social media for hours on end, and that's not a normal thing to do. And yet it's a very normal thing to witness, right? There's something strange about a person spending hours at a time in front of their keyboard, arguing with somebody in a nested comment about something as if it is a life or death situation, right? And instead of them actually having a life that they have to move on to, right? And I think that's very telling as to what's going on here. And I think that's a broader, very broad problem, and that, in fact, the social media realities exacerbate the type of problems that we have.
Yeah.
Because what social media does is it creates a sort of alienation and an isolated living where people begin to feel very lonely, very depressed, very anxious, right? It exacerbates those feelings.
Yeah.
So what happens is people become frenetic, right? They lash out, become argumentative. And that's just a function of just this broad-based displacement that people are finding themselves in. And we have to provide for people, I think, principally this idea of how do we give, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, right? Allah says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا استجيبوا لله وللرسول, right? Oh, you who believe, respond to Allah and His Messenger. إذا دعاكم لما يحييكم, when they call you to that which gives you life. And I think that what's occurred in the West is a tremendous opportunity for Muslims if they could only recognize it, like this imperative to do da'wah and to provide people an alternative discourse and a way of understanding themselves and the world and their placement in it, and God and submission and faith and prophetology and the Prophet ﷺ, and everything that gives to a person in this life and the next, right? If we can communicate the profundity of that and show that how that gives us a true expression of how to be just people in society, of how to be moral citizens, of how to think of ourselves, of how to disagree and enter into disagreements in a way that is comported towards truth and not victory, but truth becomes the locus of what we're going for, I think people participate differently.
I think
And
so, yeah.
when a person is geared towards truth, it may mean that they become very angry, right? Right? Anger becomes justifiable in certain contexts, right? Because as a Muslim, we love and we hate for Allah's sake. Right? Both of those things are justified. The Prophet ﷺ, right? Allah described him as a giver of glad tidings and a warner, bashira wa nadira, right? So it's not as if we just become dispassionate, indecisive citizens who don't have opinions about things, but it's that our passions emanate from a place of deep moral commitment and connection to God. And that's something that's sustainable. What the social justice current is, to me, is it's very much a fad. And it is going, for many Muslims, it is going to produce a type of burnout effect and a jadedness and a cynicism. Because what happens when people do not find at the end of the tunnel the type of promises that the social justice movement has given to them?
They become the baby boomers.
Of course, they just become consumers who are lost in society and have no location, and they are resentful, and they become contemptible towards people. They have a lot of contempt towards others. And that type of attitude is one that I think is a natural outgrowth. I think the social justice movement a lot of times midwives those the sort of idealistic young person, and it births a sort of cynical detachment from the world, because it rides so high on promises of trying to change the world into this sort of utopian betterment. And it is only when people begin to realize that there has to be more to the world than this, and that this isn't giving me the type of personal fulfillment that I thought it was going to give me. And in fact, it's resulting in me being derelict to the type of moral duties and obligations that I should be looking after, whether it's my family, my wife, my children, my husband. All of these things are things that are more deeply located in faith-based realities. The family, the masjid, right? And it's not, and that's why we have to try to present a complementary vision that is not sort of oblivious to being justice-oriented, but that sees justice in a larger framework, right? That's anchored in the Quran and Sunnah, right? Because when a person looks at things that way, they recognize that dhulm and injustice is not simply a function of humans transgressing on other humans, but it's also a function of a person not fulfilling their rights in front of Allah. And that's why Allah referred to shirk as dhulm. Inna shirka la dhulmun azim. Right? Luqman said to his son, وَإِذْ قَالَ لُقْمَانُ لِابْنِهِ وَهُوَ يَعِظُهُ يَا بُنَيَّ لَا تُشْرِكْ بِاللَّهِ. Right? That indeed shirk, indeed associationism, right? Not giving Allah His rights, right? All of those things, sort of disbelief in God, that is the most manifest and greatest form of injustice that can ever be aggressed and asserted in this world, right? And so that's a broader paradigm through which we're looking at injustice, that we're not only geared towards human wrongs, which is very important, but we're also geared towards the type of wrongs that causes people to miss out vis-a-vis their relationship with God.
Yeah. Closing thoughts. Is there a split that will happen in the Muslim community as a result of these type of exchanges?
Yeah, I think the Muslim community has a lot of decisions that it has to make. And I think one of those decisions is are they sort of a community that's defined on the basis of a political shared identity that has no underlying meanings beyond what people give to it? Or are we a community of people that are defined on the basis of the Quran and Sunnah? Right? Is Islam a representative rubric, or are we just going to make that into a sort of cosmetic identity group? I think that's one thing. I think ultimately, at some point, there is probably going to be a rupture. If you look at every other religious community, there's been ruptures that have swung along liberal and conservative lines. And I think that's probably bound to happen. And the question is, how do we try to anticipate the types of challenges that people have, such that we can prevent them from moving into those things? And if there is a hope that perhaps we come out of this with, it is that more and more people are attuned to the idea that we have to be engaged with young Muslims in trying to commit them to an expression of faith that's serious and religion that's serious. Because so long as we don't do that, the only times in which we're ever going to be in conversation with them is when we get personally attacked, right? And that's liable to happen for anybody. And the idea is that that type of engagement for a lot of people seems very sort of opportunistic, right? It seems like the only reason now you're talking because you got attacked personally,
Yeah.
right? That's sort of the way that people, but you haven't made the same overtures or efforts to really engage with us for any number of years while wrongs have been taking place elsewhere, nor have you been engaged with the Muslim community on any number of issues in which your voice may have been useful, usable, and important, right? In trying to help Muslims understand public life, right? Trying to get them to understand public life. And I think this retreat from engaging with Muslims is in fact quite problematic, right?
Yeah.
And I get it. I get the fact that sometimes the social justice movement and the people on the front lines can be very petulant, right? I get the fact that it can come off like a bunch of entitled, spoiled kids who are just upset that they're not at the adults table. And there's, that's sort of how it can come off, right? It can
come off that way. But look, man, I remember when I was young, I got married early, and I was in a rough spot in my mid-20s, and
Sure.
I got an offer from Caterpillar to join their company.
Okay.
And,
Sure.
And I was like, well, I talked to a whole bunch of friends, and 99%, I can remember only one person who said, hey, you know what? It's good that you're declining this offer. But everyone else said that, like, no, dude, go ahead and take it. Now,
Sure.
This is coming from someone who didn't really understand all the dynamics of social activism, but understood that there is a loyalty that you have to your brothers abroad. That and it comes from your faith. It's not tied to there wasn't no social justice movement 10 years ago. Even if it was very nascent. This was just me operating from whatever little knowledge I had of the BDS movement. I was avid follower of Chomsky in my younger years, and this is
very intelligent insights from Chomsky.
And this is that type of engagement he said like really pisses off the establishment, that when you things like the BDS movement is something why I'm really, it's not because there's some people, Mashaykh, who say people support BDS because it's fashionable, but not for me. It was never in fashion for me. I did it when it was not in fashion, when it really hurt my family the most, But alhamdulillah, I knew, I told my wife, hey, look, I'm declining this offer. And within 2-3 weeks, another offer came along, and I took it. And that's the way. That's how we were taught the faith, though, man. And I don't know if the social justice movement today is undergirded with that same type of sentiment.
No, and I think you're right. Like, look, even if someone's doing something that's fashionable, it doesn't make it wrong, right? Someone can do something right that is fashionable. Something fashionable can be correct too, right?
Right.
I think to your point, though, I think that whose responsibility is it to try to inculcate an alternative ethic? Who's going to take on the responsibility? I think if we're waiting for sort of progressive activists to do that, who have already come out in favor of LGBT, who've already come out sort of in favor of legalizing marijuana and narcotics, who have basically paid nothing but lip service to the moral commitments of Islam, then we're going to be waiting a long time.
Yeah.
And we can get upset with them because they're not doing that. But the idea is that we're expecting of them something that they're probably not going to be as interested in doing. And if the only thing that we're going to do is critique and condemn them without having a positive vision of how people can understand things in the world today, then I think what we're doing is we're actually recapitulating the problem that already exists, which is the problem of dislocation, right?
Yeah.
Which is leaving people again with a empty glass, right? We might say, well, that drink is unhealthy to drink and it's toxic and it's poisonous, but I'm still thirsty,
Yeah.
right? And you haven't given me anything that can quench that thirst,
Yeah.
right? You haven't seeded that field with crops that can grow. And this is. I also think that to a large extent, this is part of what the sort of intellectual program of the modern West does, because it is so obsessed with people participating at a sort of distance with their subject matter. Right. This is what academia does. It's all about critique. It's so engrossed in the idea of critical thinking. There's an engrossment with it. And although critical thinking can be important to a certain extent, what happens is people get so suspicious of truth claims that they're unable to establish strong notions of truth. They're unable to figure out right and wrong. And that's why I see even organizations and institutions and individuals that are trying to address and minister to people, what they do is they present to them an Islam that is so confusing, so complex, so variegated, so pluralistic, that the average Muslim cannot take away from that what's right and what's wrong in this situation, right? Right? I mean, the abortion debate just gets so convoluted that I don't know what to believe.
Right.
And it sort of vindicates a person just to say, well, it's complicated, right?
Yeah.
And that type of critical distance from every moral issue of the day is something that many academics live with their whole life. And they feel just the pursuit itself is sort of the sacred thing. The sacred thing is just the pursuit. But the arrival at a serious destination, right, that's, that can be the sort of risk of potentially arriving at something in error, is seen as being so problematic that a person is better off just constantly being non-committal across their life. And so when we talk about higher notions of truth, higher notions of moral commitments, and the big questions that need to be answered in life, right? How do we provide people answers to those big questions unless we're willing to ground them in strong notions with moral clarity as to right and wrong, right? And we have to be able to speak in that language without eliminating diversity, but while recognizing that we need to discern between that to provide people clarity, because people need to know what to do, right? And that to me is something that I think we haven't provided for people. And the social justice movement does that for people. Social justice movement doesn't give them a world of ikhtilaf, right? It doesn't give them 20 opinions on what to do in this situation. It provides them moral clarity. It provides them right and wrong. It tells them how they can be on the right side of history, right? And I think far too often as Muslims, we have failed in our ministering to people precisely because we get so lost in the debates. I mean, I think there's a fetishizing today of theory, right? Sort of legal theory and theological theory, right? Usul, being a scholar of usul is seen as being very enlightened today, because you're not engaged in the subject matter of how people live their Islam, which is fiqh, right? Those are sort of the legal norms that tell us how we make wudu and marriage, divorce, and everything's involved there. Just teaching someone fiqh is seen as too uncritical in attachment. It is too base. It is not intellectually stimulating, even though it is very practical in its applications as to what Muslims are supposed to do at different points in time. In theology, in telling me how I understand God and what I'm supposed to believe. But the theory itself becomes the crowning achievement, such that we spend all our time there, but we never transition. And we can't make decisive decisions on important issues because we are imperiled by our obsession with pluralism and diversity and just the sort of grandiose multiplicity of opinion and being multidimensional with our faith. And what that leaves people is a really profound state of just total and complete confusion. And I think you have so many young Muslims who just don't know what to think about so many issues because they don't find people speaking to them in morally compelling terms and clear, unequivocal terms about right and wrong, about, and this is, I mean, if you look at the Quran and Sunnah, it is not this convoluted mess. That's not what it is, right? It's very direct and straightforward, right? مَن يُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ, right? Whoever believes in Allah and Allah, do this, don't, right? فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا أَوْ لِيَصْمُتْ, right? I mean, it's very direct. Speak well, I mean, you're speaking to people at a level where you're providing them moral instruction that they can take away and live their life with. And it's like, how can you have this corpus of revelation that is so unambiguous and clear on the biggest questions in life, and have a religious discourse that is nothing but unending convolution?
Yeah.
And point and counter. I mean, that to me, I think, is a tremendous missed opportunity. And it is leaving people in a location where they are not finding meaning, they're not finding purpose. And I think part of the reason that we're incapable of doing that is that we are so concerned by the competing ideological agendas that we were sort of constantly trying to anticipate the possible complications that will stand between a person and their ability to accept what Allah and His Messenger have said. And I think we have to have some tawakkul and trust in Allah that the sort of power of the message can overcome those things. And perhaps people listening to something that's countercultural and violates their presuppositions is in fact a benefit to them, right?
Yeah.
It may be beneficial to them. Instead of walking them off the plank, it might provide them something that is enlightening and reassuring, precisely because it's, well, maybe there is some truth to that, right? Maybe this feminist discursive doesn't have the last word on gender, but instead Islam is providing me a way of understanding gender that is far more serious and real and reflective of how people live their lives in a upright and ethical way.
And reflective of biology.
Of course.
You know?
Of course. I mean, it is insanity what's taking place in these domains. I mean, this idea that we're so that we just feel this sort of lack of confidence, and you know, I think it's a very I think it's very unfortunate what's taken place, and I think we have an opportunity in front of us to take that high ground and to use it for our advantage. And I think there's so much we can talk about today. I mean, talk about pornography today. I mean, this is the single largest pastime of the average American. Maybe the single largest pastime of the average male in the world today. And yet there's nothing more dehumanizing than that to women. It is the complete animalizing and objectifying of women that is on display in those types of arenas. And yet it is proliferating and burgeoning at levels that is creating untold sexual dysfunction, that people can't even have relationships with one another. You talk about the collapse of the family, right? And we're just, for whatever reason, I feel like Muslims feel that they can't speak to these issues. And I don't know why. I don't know why we don't have a confident assertion and articulation of these issues, especially given how real they are to the average Muslim.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And we entrench them in debates that have no bearing on their lives, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's crazy to me that this constitutes the full corpus of what we're discussing, and we don't have a way of connecting the real issues that they're dealing with in a way that provides them theological and spiritual confidence. Allah knows, man. Yeah.
Oh, man. I mean, there's so many points you made. Just first, regarding just the way we engage online. I remember just recently having a discussion with Sheikh bin Hamad Ali online, where I was disagreeing with him on something, and then I caught myself, because I felt like, there could be something lost in translation, and I was like, you know what, Sheikh, I respect you so much. Let's have a conversation. Let's have a podcast together, and I don't want things in writing being misunderstood. There's a lot more that happens when we communicate, and tone is lost, eye contact is lost, sincerity is lost, and humility is lost when in the mode of social media communication. And I just said, you know what, I just we'll talk about it later, and whenever you come back, we can talk about it. And I think maybe his followers thought that, oh, you know what, he's running away from an argument. That's fine. We'll talk about it later, and that's fine. You have to have some kind of confidence in you, your internal state. I think a lot of people's is
Discipline.
missing.
You just have to have some discipline to say, it's not worth keep continuing, right?
Yeah.
And it's scary. I'll tell you something that happened to me, and this was a couple of years ago. I had written a post on Facebook, and it was a criticism of a fatwa that Seeker's Guidance had put out on abortion.
Yeah.
I had criticized it, and I shared the fatwa, and I wrote some criticisms of it. And Allah knows I tried to be sensitive and not too condemnatory and all of that. And some people responded upset with what I had written. Other people really supported me. It's sort of the typical factionalizing of everything, right? And there was one individual, I don't even know, he messaged me privately on Facebook. Facebook messaged me at that time. And I didn't know who this individual was. He was clearly very passionate about Seeker's Guidance and was, a student of theirs or something, right? He had some loyalty to them. I don't know the details of it. But he was very angry at me, very angry. And, people can be angry at somebody for writing something critical. But he accused me of enabling rape and justifying rape.
Wow.
And so I can tell you, I was really shaken when I saw that. I was like, Allah, where the heck where did this, we just went to code red in a single exchange. How did you get that? Right? And, I responded and I said, and I was very sort of, tried to be kind. I said, Assalamu alaikum, brother. Jazakallah khair for your nasiha. So I'm trying to understand where I did that. If I did that, I'm more than willing to correct myself. And alhamdulillah, he sort of apologized and backed off and all that. But I remember thinking to myself at that time, if this guy just goes public with these types of criticisms, chances are that there's going to be a good number of people that just latch onto it and accept it.
Yeah.
Without looking in and verifying them at all. Is just going to be taken as a truth, right?
Yeah.
Because people may not like the politics that I have. By that point, I had already written enough against the LGBT movement and stuff like that. And so the idea is that, this guy's already, the reason he's doing this is because he has some underlying hate or antagonism towards women.
Yeah.
And this is evidenced by his justifying of rape and the violence of women, and he's threatening their existence and all that type of stuff. And that stuff happens so quick. And it's all I could have done is probably just apologize or something for something I'd never done. There's no, you can keep screaming. It's where did I do this? But it doesn't matter, right? There's a point at which the social media discourse can be so uncharitable towards people, and it can rush to judgment without even allowing for people to try to defend themselves. And again, it's a difficult place for us to have discussions, but it is one of the few places in which these discussions take place. We don't have an alternative. And for so many Muslims, they're not attached to the masjids. They're not attached to Muslim institutions. The relationship to Islam and to Muslims is on social media. So we have to try to connect to them there. That's my view. I think we have to make some efforts, but we just have to think through how we do it. And we have to be sensitive to these problems in a way that isn't sort of condemning these people and is alive to the types of problems that exist vis-a-vis the forum itself.
And even with regards to scholars themselves, when you or Imams or what have you, when was the last time you've ever heard of, I know one scholar who regularly admits, through YouTube lectures and stuff, and I'll just say it because I gotta give him credit, Sheikh Yasir Qadi, he's multiple times he's admitted to several mistakes he's made when he was younger, and he even wrote an apology letter to Sheikh Hamza Yusuf in public on a Facebook forum. But other than that, I don't see much of anyone ever saying, hey, you know what, I was wrong, and you know what, upstart little kid, you put me in place, and it goes. We all like to think of our scholars as the epitome of iman and humility and everything, but they're humans too, and they're not going to capitulate to the whims of an upstart young social justice activist. It's just not something that.
And I think we just have to be very careful. I think when we talk about scholars, we're talking about a very specific class of scholars that are popular, known, prominent. Right. I don't think that this is a fair generalization of your average local imam.
Of course, we're talking about people who are in the limelight, who they're going to feel like they look silly in front of their followers, or maybe their status will be diminished in some way if they give any sort of credibility that, hey, you know what, you made a good point there. Maybe I should be careful about my future engagements with whatever, what have you, because look, there's a general humanness we can't ignore. There's these people they're amazing human beings, and I've said that over and over again throughout the podcast. And despite that, I'll still probably get hate. But
Yeah.
no, I'm just it's from both sides actually. The social justice people will say, "Oh, you hammered on social justice warriors for half an hour. You might have said a 5 minute thing about scholars." But I'm trying to be as even handed as possible. Yes, we've mentioned that the responses could have been better. Brother Ali Al-Arian, he missed a mark.
People to me are never going to be satisfied with how blame
because
is
they're always going to choose their team, and that no matter what, they can't ever concede.
Blame evenly enough and things like that. And so it is what it is. I mean, that to me is not a serious critique.
Do you have any other closing thoughts, or what's next on the agenda for Mobeen Vaid, aka Master Blaster? You ever watch Mad Max?
Mad Max?
Yeah, Mad Max, the old movie.
No, I have not seen it. There was a new remake of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I haven't seen either one. You like it, huh?
No, Master Blaster is...
My movie reference, all of my references, like, you have to realize, like, my pop culture references are still, like, Tupac and stuff, right? I'm so dated. Like, I realize, as I be like, oh, we want you to speak at this MSA. And I'm like, what am I going to connect with this? What am I going to talk to them about, right?
We're both from the same generation. We're both from the same generation. So Mad Max, you should have grown up on that.
No, man, I was big into sports growing up, to be honest. I was a big sports guy. I still am. I mean, fantasy football and sports and all that. I like sports as an outlet. And I know a lot. There's this liberal thing about like just talking very derisively about the NFL and sports and that. But I don't think that. I think there's actually a lot to be gained from the types of friendships and sort of the friendly ribbing that you can get in sports.
Yeah.
Sports is one of the few places in the world that it's just not enmeshed in sort of the intensity of politics and the type of really active fights that we have going on. You can have very friendly rivalries, and I think there's something to be said for that. Just building bonds with people. It's a nice way to connect with people you don't know. Again, I'm not saying it's this great Islamic thing to do. Right? Don't mistake me. But I think there's a lot that is sort of positive about faith, just socially and what it does for people. But I mean, I'd say in terms of what's next for me, I mean, I just continue writing. That's all I do.
Yeah.
And so, I obviously write on my blog on occasion. Allah knows if there's any benefit coming out. Inshallah, there's some khair. And then, just researching and writing different research papers that seem to always be in progress, but inching slowly towards completion. So we'll see, inshallah.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much for coming on. And I know, you came on short notice. Really appreciate it. If there's anything that we can do to promote any of your work, or we'd be happy to help you out in any way possible. I mean, this is not my work. No, we're benefiting. I'm not giving you charity. We're benefiting from many of your thoughts. A lot of the people in the comment section are super excited to see you, and they're really happy with what you've said so far, and to help them organize some of their thoughts a little bit better, so that the world makes a little bit more sense for everyone. And that's, I think, what should be the goal for all of us ultimately, right?
Yeah, and obviously, I think this goes without saying. I usually make a point of saying this whenever, or writing this whenever I write. But obviously, Allah knows best. It's possible that my analysis of this situation is wrong as well, right? And we have to be open to the fact that even though we're very confident about our convictions, that we may not have a full and accurate reading of certain situations. And so, I try to always tread very carefully and think through very seriously the arguments made by people that I disagree with. And I think that's something that we should try to do, not because we want to go on sort of the critical thinking discursive constantly, but because we want to make sure that we're not dismissing people outright when there may be some value that we can obtain from the types of things they're saying. So, Allahumma stan.
For anyone willing to help us out on putting out this content, help us out on patreon.com/the For my guest this evening, Mobeen Vaid, aka the Vader. You know who Vader is, right?
Darth Vader. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's usually the
Finally,
reference I'll use in meetings. People say how you pronounce your last name. I'll say it's Vaid, like
you know
Vader.
how many references I was trying to use this podcast, or and I know like I was asking you earlier, like, hey, do you know what was that Stranger Things is? Because I wanted to use
Yeah.
Demogorgon
Ah,
because of
yeah,
demagogue.
yeah.
Get it? Demogorgon's a monster from Stranger
Sure,
Things, and
sure.
that's why I couldn't use it. But
Yeah.
there it is. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us. We'll have a good weekend. Happy
You
Labor
too.
Day, I guess. We can say Happy Labor Day, right? That's not haram. All right, brother. Talk to you
Labor
guys
Day
later.
Mubarak.
Yeah, man. Okay.
All
We'll
right,
see y'all
brother.
later.
Assalamu
Assalamu alaikum.
alaikum. Okay, we're good.